now we're moving to our last panel of the day. And as we promised, and actually is the part of the title of the symposium, I would say, one of the ideas is to talk about what's next, right? What are the future agendas for social design? So we have the pleasure to have again a really interesting panel with academics and also people from the policy sector that are going to join us today. So we have Thomas, we have Dan, and we have Joyce. I asked them if they want the title. They said, no, we can do that by ourselves. So I'm not going to get into their titles. So yeah, I'm going to pass it to you.
Thanks, David, and thanks for the invitation to come to Lancaster. It's a real pleasure having the conversation today. I'm Thomas Markussen. I'm professor of social design, and I co-founded the social design unit together with Eva Knudts that you heard in the first panel. It's 10 years ago, 2015. We've been working for a number of years at the design school in Kolding, and then we decided to move to the University of Southern Denmark. I don't know how much I should be introducing now. I think maybe we decided to go briefly in the introductions, and then we can tell more about it later on. So I'd like to pass it on to Dan.
Cheers. Thank you, Thomas. Good afternoon, isn't it now, everybody? So, yeah, my name's Daniel Clarke. Not from an academic social design perspective. I work for Lancaster City Council, working in partnership development and strategic policy. But I'm really a practitioner, really. In my career history, I've worked in different areas of social importance, working with young offenders and alternative education programmes, and also in apprenticeship provision, working with the private sector in creating apprenticeship opportunities, and then obviously now more recently working for the local government sector in different areas of partnership and policy development.
Hi everyone, nice to meet you, nice to see you, thank you for the invitation. My name is Joyce Yee. I'm a professor of design and social innovation at Northumbria University in Newcastle upon Tyne, and I guess a lot of the work that I'm doing, similarly like Thomas and Eva, I started this, the designing for social design, hang on, do I know my own network? Designing in social innovation, design and social innovation network in Asia Pacific, DESIAP. Sorry, it's just been kind of a long day. In 2015 as well, so actually it's coming up to 10 years, and the aim is really to try to understand the type of designing that is happening in other contexts, other cultural contexts specifically, and particularly understanding what kind of local practices have been there that's doing very similar things to what we might be framing as design in a more formal sense. And I guess as a way of introduction, I know we were asked to do a bit of what kind of social value does our work do, and I was just going to show you a short video of the work that has come out from the network. There's two strands at the moment. I'm working away from Newcastle in a sense. This is in Asia, based in Asia Pacific, and we were running an online mentoring program for women craftspeople and social innovators in Australia, Japan, Malaysia, and Thailand. So that's one strand of work, and the other strand, I don't think we have time, but I might show the video later on, is the last 2 years I've been working with a colleague in psychology looking at food poverty and the holiday activities, food programs, and working with, actually there's a strand of working with young people. I think a few of the panelists mentioned that, and we were looking at trying to design a more youth-specific program for them. But I'll show you just one video of our online mentoring and I guess some of the testimonials from the women themselves.
Well, the reason why we felt this was an important program is because women in creative sectors often face common barriers which is what we heard, to do with lack of access, support and opportunities. And the things that were available to them, like leadership and mentorship training, tended to focus on skills and individual improvements. And what we wanted to try and think about is to reframe what leadership and mentoring might be.
Yeah, definitely change how I approach things, because I was given so much freedom to kind of chart my own path, which before this, like, it's always very hierarchical, like, oh, this is the way, like, you follow me and then you do my path basically, and it's just something you just have to struggle as a young woman, you know, and then later on, maybe when you're older, then you can chart your own path. But I think this mentoring program made me realize, like, no, I can. Yeah, I have the space, I have the freedom to kind of, you know, think and be proactive about thinking where I want to go, my trajectory.
When I first joined, I expected to have more like structured work, but it was very refreshing to see a very organic way of doing the mentorship, and I wasn't used to it, but it made me open up more. I felt like I was given permission to be more creative or to think out of the box, and you know, I got inspiration from that.
Our focus throughout the project has been on relationship building as a way of building trust and creating a supportive environment in which women feel listened to. Kindness and generosity are how we try to work. We try to have that as the basis for how we work. And we've really been trying to create space for women and supporting them to have voice, rather than the more top-down skills-based approach of many mentoring and leadership programs. The other key aspect in that is recognizing the value that everyone brings to their communities and to the project, regardless of age or any other aspect, and tailoring how women are supported to their interests and their ways of working.
I think the transformation is very personal. I felt that I've grown so much in the past year because I was able to find ways to help myself or to ask for help. And they say you can't pour from an empty cup. I feel that the whole program is a process of getting different things into my cup. And the process and the experience of receiving kindness and support from the program allows me to then pass the kindness to other people in my context or in my work environment.
That was 18-month program basically that ended last year, and we're still trying to and we still have a good relationship with the women. And in terms of impact, we talked about evaluation. Because we have that relationship, we know we can kind of almost track where they're going with it, and I think that's relationality is something we go back to on and over again, and it takes time to do that. So anyway, that's a short, a bit longish introduction. I'll pass you over to Dan, which will kick us off.
Cheers, thank you, Joyce. So for the obviously panel topic of social agendas future social agendas for social design, we thought we would put a Lancaster place-based slant on the conversation really to stimulate things. So this is, if you can see, I know the text is probably a bit small, but I'll summarise. This is a snapshot of the Lancaster City Council plan for the next 3 years leading to 2027. And this really, I think, reflects both global and national challenges, really, social economic challenges. But obviously, we're kind of translating that to the place-based area and what this means for the Lancaster district. So each column is relevant to a principle which kind of runs through all of our service delivery and policy and project work at the City Council. And then underneath that, we've got a number of themes which are the core strategic areas to deliver on those principles. And then a number of ambitions, or they could be called outcomes essentially, when we're delivering these principles, and they're kind of listed number 1 to number 6, roughly in terms of priority. So it's quite a clear plan in terms of what we want to do. So that, just to summarise really, we've got the climate emergency in the sustainable district and what that means in practice for service delivery, working with partners, an inclusive and prosperous local economy, which is looking at economic development and addressing things around economic inequalities. And then the third column is around health, population health and community engagement. And then obviously really importantly as well is number 4, which is around the council's kind of mandatory service delivery. So that's, you know, your bin collections, main parks, green spaces, all of this kind of stuff. So in terms of future social agendas for the council at least, and this is developed through working with partners and councillors and a bit of community engagement, we feel this is a good reflection of social agendas for this district. We'll touch on the challenges, I think, in a moment when David starts the questions, but part of the work that I'm involved with is recognising that the challenge for the public sector and the local government sector is, as we're all probably aware, the financial context is really important, and this is of importance for the third sector as well. So the mandatory services, there's been a real increased demand for those mandatory services within the local community, but the local authority has a responsibility and a role to play in some of these ideological, political, socio-economic priorities that we can see on the screen. So we're really mindful of the fact that this needs to be done collaboratively with partners, and from a social design perspective, we have done work with Lancaster University and would like to do more to really look at how we can deliver some of these ambitions at the place-based level with different organisations.
I think one of the things, the reasons why we thought it was a really good kickoff for our conversation was that it raises, for me, a lot of very important questions when we see a plan like this. Of course, how do we know that ambitions are met? This is concerned with impact, which I guess when taxpayers' money are spent, we would like to know whether we have value for money, or at least that is the pressure. And the next thing would be, what is the role of social design? Is it used as a co-design process with citizens? And how do the citizens actually react when the co-design is used as a political instrument? Just to give you an anecdote, I come from a city which is around 80,000 citizens. And the city council is pretty fond of itself as calling it a design city. And co-design is permeating all of the political organization. And we have people traveling from the design schools into the political organization and doing all kinds of citizen participation. Then a number of years ago, they came out with a new strategy, a bit like this one, but I think not as good as this one. So the city council was proclaiming that now they had a new strategy. They were calling it "We Design Life." And the citizen would say, well, no, you are not mine, please don't. Then they took a bit of reflection upon that, and then they said, well, we're going to change the strategy to "Together we design life." And then citizen would say, well, maybe we can talk about it. We are not sure yet, but I was kind of curious when Dan showed us this to learn more about how citizens was involved in making these policies. And you said, Dan, that actually they were, and citizens' voices have been integrated. So maybe you could elaborate a bit on how.
Yeah, sure. I think, you know, community engagement is one of the principles in this plan, but it's also a challenge as well in that it's, you know, that's an area of design in itself. How do you actually engage with communities effectively? I think for the climate emergency in a sustainable district, a few years back the council delivered what was called the People's Jury, which was a consultation engagement process with different members of the community to see what was important to them around the climate emergency, what needed to be done, what it meant in practice, what kind of policies should be put in place. So I think that was a real kind of tangible community engagement exercise, but the council's also got some colleagues that work in community engagement, so there's a dedicated resource to daily community engagement to ensure that what the council's doing is relevant to the community, but their kind of insight and perspective is fed into the council's planning. And there have also been a number of community conversations that the council's delivered, which kind of stemmed from the COVID era, when everybody, you know, we had the lockdown situation, and there was teams, community consultation, community conversation events with the community, and that's kind of continued, and it's evolved from that kind of community outreach work during COVID to be more of a strategic conversation on some of the aspects of this council plan. But I think also what's really important is that in recent times I've been working with different stakeholders such as the football club and other third sector organisations. I know that Jen does a lot of kind of engagement with the council as well. And I think the Lancaster district really benefits from the fact that we've got very diverse third sector, charity-based organisations, community organisations, social enterprises, and that's essentially can be a route into the community, and that is the voice from the community that we can engage with to ensure that what we're doing as a council is reflective of the residents that we serve.
Thanks, Dan. And I think it's also, I was interested when Dan showed us the priorities, strategic priorities as well, because I think a lot of this conversation this morning around the panels was about kind of serendipity, and you kind of stumble into things and you do it because you're passionate, or you have a connection with someone in that community and you want to support them. And I think that's how things starts, and you build that up. But I think increasingly you want to think sort of long-term and longevity and sustainability around that. So connecting that to policy, understanding what are the mechanism of how change happens, and a kind of, even at community scale, at local scale, at regional scale. Personally, for me as a design researcher, is really important, because I'm starting to think, and I don't want to talk about scale. Scale isn't right for these things, but actually how you diffuse that impact and make that longer term, and connecting that, and me understanding what has been identified as priorities by the powers to be, and thinking about actually how can I tap into and then leverage on that is really is an interesting stage that I'm at in my own the way of thinking about social designing and working with these elements about how do you create social value. And so I was really interested, and I also trying to understand how policies are made, who gets to decide, how they decided, what are the steps involved in that, and I'm really trying to get my head around that so I can join the two things and make that more effective. So that's kind of my take, and that's why I was quite excited when Dan showed us the priorities.
Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting to have, when obviously the local authorities and national authorities, policymakers are part of this kind of social entanglement. So understanding what the priorities are and to know how the resources are being used also open up spaces actually to understand where we fit as well into our social initiatives. I don't know if it might be kind of too specific question for Dan before we jump into this one, but what about when we don't have the kind of, there might be some stuff, some details, some small type of projects or needs that might not fit into these priorities. Is there any kind of mechanism to capture those and to deal with them? Like, for example, if there is a small community that might not be representative enough to the entire population, for example, in this case of Lancaster, that is there any way to, like, for example, to work with them as well when we have this planning? It's just a question.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think this plan it's a framework essentially. It's not a very kind of binary document in that this is strict in terms of the way that we'll be doing things, and it'll evolve over time, and there'll be opportunities and there'll be challenges, and that's when we talked about the challenges for the public sector in general, not just local government. We are obviously aware of uncertainties, changes in national government, changes in national policy, unforeseen things that happens within the community. So COVID happened, for example, and that was never foreseen, and part of not just the council but for social actors, third sector organisations, is being prepared and engaged with one another to reflect the local area basically, and there'll be gaps within engagement, there'll be hard to reach communities, there'll be all of this kind of stuff that needs to be kind of teased out for a period of time, and I think that's a cultural issue as well between the organisations working in this field, and a communication issue. I think another area that we've talked on as a panel before was the issue of longevity as well, and how social design we've got funding issues, we've got short-term kind of policy projects of work that we may collaborate on, and then within local government, we've got kind of changes within service areas and restructures and all of this kind of things. So we've been discussing, policy labs and where there could be resource specifically to ensure that social design can contribute to the public sector, but it's actually there for the long term, and then things don't get fragmented in it's a long-term approach as opposed to short-term. And I think by doing that, some of the things that you've talked about, gaps in the policy, gaps in community engagement, could potentially plug that gap.
Thank you. Going back to the script. So the panel is all about the future agendas for social design, and to think about agenda, obviously we need to talk about this word that we have already been talking about, the challenges. So what do you think are the present challenges that we're facing at the moment in terms of social design, but also in terms of the public sector?
Well, I think Dan touched upon the issue that due to austerity politics, but the public sector is increasingly reaching out to designers to engage citizens in redeveloping services. But I think also that is a key challenge for us as a design community, because we are enrolled into an instrumentalist agenda, and sometimes that is with the aim of doing good. It could be, helping cancer patients to take care of their own treatment, but that also has a flip side, which is due to cuts in the healthcare system, that is beneficial for the system, that the patient is empowered to take over her or his own treatment. But I think what we have been faced with during the last maybe 10 years was that the design community has been haunted about design being capable of achieving these big impact measures, which I don't always think is beneficial to the field. So, for instance, we had a project with a local library. The thing is that in Denmark, the children's desire to read is dramatically dropping. So the library was thinking whether they can do interventions using art and design to have the reading desire increase. And we say that may look good in an application. You can write that into as an outcome. We will not be able to document that. I'm just saying, well, an intervention staying in a library for 8 weeks, it may stimulate children to find reading really, really interesting and inspiring. But how would you document that their reading ability or reading desire would increase? You would have to look into loaning patterns over a significant period of time. So I think we need to distinguish. When that's the challenge for me, is to attract funding. We need to talk the language of impact, outcome, outputs. But at the same time, we also have to make sure that we're not buying into a evaluation culture that is foreign to our practice. And that's why in the prison projects that we have done, believe me, we have tried to use criminology frameworks, but obviously they failed because the things that we do, the artifact worked, but the evaluation design didn't, because it was too rigid to capture the value we were creating. So I remember I had a phone call with the head of the research foundation. She said, well, did it work? I said, of course, the artifact worked, but the evaluation design sucked. Okay, then you can look at it as a pretty expensive feasibility study, she said. Okay, thank you for that. I'm just saying that we have some challenges, and I think these panels today, also the first one talking about value, who is it for? Is it for? We can see from your video, Joyce, we see that constantly. Trust, relationships, personal gains. We know design can actually do this to our participants, but how do we account for it also be, and just do to account for it being more than that? That's sometimes the question I raise, and I'll stop here and pass it on.
Thank you. So yeah, challenges, I think I've already touched on some of those kind of sector-based challenges, so I don't really need to repeat that, but I think there's for the area that I work in at least, there's a kind of twofold process to the sector-based challenges and what that means for operational capacity, etc. But then coupled with the socio-economic challenges that we all face. If you translate that to the local context, so transition to a green economy, how can that be done that it's inclusive and it's it's going to be effective and it's going to be felt by everybody? Not everybody can afford an electric car, etc. And alternative energy is not a real opportunity for some. The economy, we've obviously got issues around social mobility and wealth inequalities in the district, and we've got hard to reach communities, etc. And then for health and communities, there's issues around population health and the wider determinants of health, and that stems from the economy and all the rest of it. So I think in terms of challenges, for social design at least, there's the operational challenge to actually act on any of this stuff by the public sector, and it's getting increasingly challenging, coupled with the fact that in the future there's potentially going to be an acceleration of some of these problems. So social design and partners can support in that process, I think. And a third challenge is obviously the outcomes, and that's universal, isn't it? In that we need to be having an outcomes-based approach to this, and we talked about evaluation frameworks and metrics and all of this kind of stuff to really articulated evidence that whatever interventions or social design is put in place actually delivers things, and that's obviously of great importance for funding and everything else.
Yeah, there are many challenges, so where to start? I won't repeat, I concur and agree with some of the challenges just already raised in this panel and the other panel. I think, I suppose the main challenge perhaps is around at which point would design access and when they exit. So we talk about different modes of designing here. So one as an external, coming in, being brought into a very project-specific program with a start and end date, and that's it. And oftentimes we know that doesn't work because life doesn't happen quite that way, but that is the funding that we have. So that within the challenge is working within those boundedness of time and funding and access. And actually, how do you then address that? So we talked about perhaps having internal teams, policy labs, but not everyone or every organization, certainly at local authority level, can afford to do that, beginning to do that at kind of central government. But that also doesn't solve some of the other challenges. So I think it's just recognizing that a lot of what we train our students for in terms of how to do designing just doesn't work because it's done for-profit, commercial, industry-focused approach. So the challenge, I think, as a wider design research, design educators community is how do we better prepare our students for this kind of work? And reflecting from all the panels today, it's just so many things that I've put down under skills, mindset, ways of talking, ways of framing. None of them is really recognizably design in that formal sense, right? In the Bauhaus sense. So I think that challenge is how we bring those other skill sets, mindsets into how we talk about design, how we critique about design, how we reflect about design, so that we can better be prepared. And David talked about the homework that you do. That's not homework, that is designing. That is, but the way we then frame design is the outcomes, the prototype, the impact stories. Even the impact stories is, we're beginning to talk about that more because we have to around what is the impact on that. And I think the challenge is really trying to, within the design community, be a bit more open about what that is, and then be better able to frame that for when we're working with stakeholders, with local authorities, understanding those languages of the priorities, the evaluation framework, the outcomes, the KPIs, because we need to bridge that gap to be able to frame it in a way that that's our value to them, but we also then have access and work with them longer term. So many challenges, but just a few.
This is, the next question is going to be more about future, but before we jump into that one, I have worked with the local authority, with different departments of the city council, and because one of the social issues that we're facing is all the austerity measurements and stuff like that. And normally the question is how we can do more with less, and how design can help into that. And it's pretty much, if we go back to, I don't know, like 100 years ago, and maybe production line and trying to produce more with less resources and stuff like that. How do you feel about that in terms of, taking that approach of being more efficient, right? In a way to support, or to help with this problem that we're facing at the moment, and using design actually to tackle those kind of issues as well. It's not here, sorry.
I think doing more with less kind of summarizes it perfectly, doesn't it? But I guess in simplistic kind of terms, and something that is already something that through working with colleagues and the university and stuff we've already tried to do, is just increasing effective collaboration and partnerships work. Now, that in itself is quite loose, and there's probably a role in design and social design. So what partners and what stakeholders, and how do you want to do it in a local context, and what's going to be the outcomes? So I think designing those kind of partnerships and collaborations for an outcomes-based approach relevant to priorities and ambitions and strategies is important. But then just that ambition of partnerships and collaboration is at least one opportunity to address this issue of less with more, do things collectively, shared resources and collective outcomes.
I think as sort of design researchers, we need to, Laura brought up politics. We need to be aware of the politics. We need to be aware of whose agenda are we delivering to and why. Are we okay with that? If we're okay, but how do we subvert that? And I think some of the work is about kind of understanding that is the practicality and the reality of it. There is just no money. We just need to do what we can, and if design can help support that, great. But at the same time, I think it's also about the advocacy around, well, this is just not good enough, and we can't do it. And perhaps some of the prototype that Thomas, you and Eva did, was there to provoke, to bring that forward, these two very different ways of thinking about cancer care. It's quite abstract when you talk about it, but when you're confronted with something, and I think design is very good at doing that. And the advocacy that Laura, you're doing, and the work that I'm involved with in the HAF program is about kind of austerity, is about kind of, the reason why free school meals is because there's huge amount of inequality. And, it's very unfortunate for a first world country to have to offer that to kids, right? But we know it's doing well, and to think about that, actually, we're not going to get any additional funding from central government for the HAF programs that will finish in 2024. But how can we work to deliver, to extend that to further what its value is? So we're beginning to work with the local authorities in the Northeast, trying to pull together resources and say, actually, there are other funding they can bring into that's about supporting youth services and youth development into that space, and to use that as a platform. So there's also ways to strategize around it, but you need to understand the kind of where the funding is, where the landscape is, and where the priorities are to kind of tap into that. And that's why I think as a social designers, you need to do more than just the work. You need to kind of think, you're a community organizer, you're an activist, you're whatever it needs to be at that point. And I think, but recognizing first all the agendas there, doing your homework, knowing who's in the room, who has the power, how does decision get made, why does it get made there, who's in there, is really important. And for a long time, designers don't really want to do that. They don't want to attack that because it seems a bit like, I'm a bit squeamish about that. Ooh, but we need to get our hands dirty in that sense. So.
Just another one to add to that. I think it's really important to recognize it's a twofold process, isn't it? I completely agree. And a role for social design is to understand the place-based context and strategy and policy and government and all the rest of it. But I think Francesco mentioned it when you worked with a local authority, and there's this kind of fearful of disruption and disrupting process and all this kind of stuff. I think there's an opportunity for social designers to do more of that, so that the rigid policy kind of formulation can be influenced more from grassroots organisations, from social designers, creative thinkers, this kind of stuff. So that so it's reflective of the local area, but it addresses the art of the possible, and it takes things out of the the silos of local government, and it can be a different process to reach outcomes.
Yeah, David, when you ask how can we do more with less by using design, I think you directly phrased it in terms of value. So I think what we've been talking about, this is also what you're saying, Joyce. If we work out a more fine-grained, nuanced framework for understanding the values we are creating, maybe that's a way of saying what is less and what is more. When we apply for funding bodies, usually they are focusing on, I think Chris, you mentioned project value. We have to explain and make plausible what is achieved by doing this project. So in our case, in the prison project, that will be what is coming out of designing a board game that a child can play with incarcerated fathers. Well, they can maintain, hopefully, a more positive, good contact, which can be beneficial for the child. But at a certain point, we also see in that project, we were approached by management saying, well, now we hit a block in the road. The project isn't moving because the prison officers don't want the board game to come in. So the cohort of prison officers were divided. Some of them were committed to the Prison and Probation Service primary task of maximum security, controlling the prisoners. But the other half, maybe, that's a bit roughly put, but they were committed to the second task of supporting, motivating, rehabilitation. So we came out to have the project moving forward. We participated in a staff meeting and had to overcome barriers. All of a sudden we find ourselves actually doing strategic work in the prison, because that's managerial aims that we're actually trying to support. But that's also kind of valuable maybe in that organization. And we also committed, luckily we had the prison officers buying into the project again and having ownership. And I'm just saying the project value that we account for the commissioners, that wouldn't work if we didn't have the infrastructural value, which is what I'm talking about, all the processual work. And maybe if we can have people understand that project value is just one drop or tip of the iceberg, relying on all this mountain of values, which we call the ripple effects of the project. Maybe that's a way of saying also to the political system, what is the value of social design, perhaps?
Great, thank you. So we have the lunch back there, but I'm more hungry to get the answer of this question. So the next actually is more about, it's a little bit more kind of future oriented. So what type of kind of skills, mindset, resources we need to consider, for the times ahead actually for designers to catalyze social change or to create social value maybe.
Well, thank you, Joyce, because I think you said that I'm going to take what you said before. So then, we had a brief meeting on Tuesday. We talked about some of this stuff also. And I think Joyce is right. We need to educate designers and design researchers to have skills to step into political organization and deal with the politics of design, which means understanding governance at a local level. It means understanding the constraints that public services nowadays have to be co-designed for. I think maybe a better understanding also of political theory, but there's also a limit of how much you can squeeze into a design education. But definitely, maybe it's not about also only squeezing it into education. You could also think about policy labs, as you said, or different kinds of secondments where designers go out and work. We have colleagues in London working with Camden Council, who has been working with them for 10, 15 years, who figured out that they did a lot of design projects, but the proposal wasn't entering into the organization because it was sort of landing at the front door until the skills were taking into the council and maybe work inside out as well. So I think it's not only about the design side, it's also about initiating the collaboration with people like Dan and your organization.
Yeah, thanks. I think mutual learning is going to be really important, and it's not just between social designers and local government, local authorities. We've talked about schools and third sector organisations, etc. So I think mutual learning between whatever stakeholder social design is seeking to influence, or vice versa. So I think that kind of mutual learning process is really important, and that it obviously relates to relationship building, increased collaboration and communication, really. So events like this is brilliant for all of that, and any kind of opportunity to do that at a local level I'd be really interested to develop. And then also I think it's kind of repeating what we've already talked on, but kind of language, and if social design is increasingly looking to affect government policy and projects and things of that nature, an understanding of language between people interested in social design and the end goal of what it is that what social context or issue it is that they're looking to affect, and that will then translate into what we've already talked about, funding opportunities and outcomes and evaluation frameworks.
I've been making a list, listening to the panels this morning, in terms of, I guess, what kind of skills and mindsets that we need to support our design students with. And, what I've got down under, I don't even know whether it's like skills or roles, being an activist, being a community organizer, being a mediator, being able to politicate, but also thinking very carefully how you bring in self-care, how you bring in ethics, how you bring in all those things, right? So that's on top of training to be a designer, traditionally. And then in terms of the mindset, I think it's probably more important is being flexible, going in and thinking that you're not a designer, but you're a person. You're just there to listen and to understand, to be helpful in any way, shape possible. I mean, we've, tended to gardens, we've had to clean toilets, just to get things done. Is that right? You need that, we'll do that. Being resilient, because it is tough, it is long term, you're not doing it, you're not in and out. Being patient, being open to opportunities. It doesn't matter where it takes you, but you do it on a hunch or on a punt. You have to still be critical and be really aware of agendas and be reflexive of your power dynamics as a designer in that space. Generally, it's like, what does it mean by being ready to enter in these spaces, which is messy, wicked, entangled, whatever you call it, right? But at the same time, learn the bridging language and the bridging logics of different organizations that you want or will be working with, because they will have very different ideas of what outcomes and outputs are, what is value, what is evaluation, and all that kind of thing, and measurement. It doesn't mean that we have to play that game, but we need to understand it before we kind of engage with it. I think it is very complex, and there's no answer to, and that's why there's probably no job adverts for be a social designer, LinkedIn, like a lot of students say, how do I get involved? And I said, just get involved, and then as a person, and then see. And that's not helpful at all. And I think we can do more as design educators to bring all these things in through live projects, through exposure in that way. But we can also probably bring in some pedagogic practices and learnings from other trauma-informed disciplines, for example, social science, and just having those, building our emotional intelligence in order to be able to better handle these constantly changing contexts that you find yourself in all the time. So.
Thank you. I wonder if we have any question from the audience. Yeah, Francesco. Who wants to go first? Francesco, Laura, or Roger? Roger has his finger up as well.
Everything knows, and in a way, like, there is call for the political designer, and for all of you. So is there like new roles
designer. That's the
Yeah. I don't have any answers. I never consider myself political. But then, as you get older and as you see how the world works, everything's politics, right? And so I wouldn't say I'm a political designer. I'm just a designer who's aware of politics in order to work in and effectively in social spaces if you really want to be effective. And that doesn't mean the kind of politics, Westminster politics, but actually like everything's politics. Like your local team, your research team, the people you work with, that's just politics everywhere, right? So, and it's not manipulative in that sense. It's just being aware of that and just understanding. So, but I guess we just, how do we teach students to do that? I don't know. I just picked it up. We all picked it up by experience, by failures, by thinking, oh my God, I was so naive getting into that situation. Is it even right for me? So that's why I always say, if you want to get into this, I think you just need to be, your eyes need to be open to these challenges. And there is a particular, it's not for everyone. We still need designers who are good at kind of doing the traditional designing that we need. But there's some designers who are, like we all are, gravitate to this kind of messiness. And we are inherently political, I think, whether or not we call ourselves that or not.
Yeah, I just agree. I think that's the way to frame it is you can have a political conscience without overtly being political, if that makes sense. And I think that's really important. And social design, all of the conversations that have been discussed already, although not being overtly political, they are intrinsically political in some nature due to the outputs and the social context that they're all seeking to deliver. So just kind of agreeing with that point, and I think that is important for social designers to recognise.
Yes, when you were all talking about and building on that plan there, I got two thoughts. One is that we, as a society, I think we all aim to the same things. This looks the same in you and in East London or in different councils, and as a society, if you look at sustainable development goals, we can generalize. But I think what we can offer from our corner is a how, and the how looks different in different contexts. But I think we are really kind of engaging in that conversation, and not necessarily making it happen, but at least opening the space, and we have some tools to actually implement. But then I thought maybe there's a need to turn everything on its head and think of participation not as an exercise. Okay, here's the government agenda, and we need the citizens to participate. But actually, what I think is missing is education of everybody from climate school I'm engaged in and how we are responsible for governance in our own places. So turning up to a meeting, not coming into a workshop to do participation, co-creation, fun. It could be fun, but actually you're doing. If people could understand that as a civic engagement and a responsibility that we have to co-create, but then that has to be nurtured because there's a divide in kind of the way we understand politics. That all of this politics is stigmatized, especially when we work with young people. All of this comes up all the time, and it's definitely the same way. And there's this whole problematic of non-engagement. But we've equated, I guess the exercise of our democratic rights as voting, and we've narrowed down what it means to actually be a citizen, within our community. I don't know, it's a bit open. But I would say what the thing is just turning the whole thing in its head. It's like rather than trying to implement an agenda, it's just opening the spaces and all of us are learning to practice and come together.
Was
It's a comment.
Just pose your question. I have but you asked about the new role of the political designer, and I think that's very closely related to the notion of also participation and involvement. But I think it's important, as you also said, Joyce, to realize that it's really political. So we have some colleagues, for instance, in Sweden, in Malmö, they talk about participation as agonistic infrastructuring, meaning that you cannot but exclude at the same time as you try to include. And that's sort of a basic condition for participation. No matter what you do, you position people into certain roles. And I think being critically aware of doing that within, for instance, the city council and doing project work with communities is really, really important. And maybe our responsibility is also, I'm not saying that we're not achieving changes. I'm just saying that we should have a mutual learning also with other evaluation cultures and explaining what we do and being held accountable for what we do. So I think for me that's really important, that we don't promise things that we cannot achieve, because that eventually will have people being very fed up with co-design or idealism and participation as well. That's the thing. It becomes pure tokenism.
I think they're having participation fatigue. The residents are like, what, you're coming to us asking us things again? And I think there's also that balance, isn't it? And to know when to use it and promising the immediate value, or knowing that and then thinking what's the longer term potential value. But yeah, we could be in danger of that as well.
But I think, yeah.
Well, I want to make a comment and maybe I was done. Well, I want to respond to your proposition about how we can create more value with less. To be honest, it's very problematic, and I don't think we should. And already, also when I was working with Paul Rogers for the design priority area, actually working, surveying all the different research companies, actually design always other delivers and gets the least funding. So I don't think we should actually stretch ourselves to deliver more. But actually we should actually reframe what the measures of success are. If you consider maybe economic value, maybe they think our value is less, but the social value we produce and deliver is huge. So if we shift from that quantitative measures, but actually we also acknowledge and value the social value we create, I think we're doing pretty well, more than other disciplines. And then other things I want to mention is, as well, social innovation sometimes often come from these austerity systems, and because of the lack of funding, then as creative citizens we become creative and come up with social innovations, but it's also problematic and we become resilient, but the system should provide the public services that we already pay for through our taxes. And then another thing was, you mentioned, Joyce, the scale, and yeah, it can be problematic. We have this obsession for scaling up, but eventually it will be more about scaling out. And maybe about future agendas, I think in a way what I'm understanding from the different panels, possibly one strong report will be about evaluation, because it's been obvious that we need more research on how to evaluate social impact. Something about training for social designers and potentially reframing pathways for employment. Something to be more about, I'm not sure, but social entrepreneurship as well maybe was not mentioned, but often we come up with social innovation, but then we also need new business models for this social innovations to be sustainable. So, and then, how to sustain these innovations through infrastructure. And then as well, something is about the work, as social designers always have an ambition to create change in others, but also the inner work we need to do, and the change we create in ourselves. So something about that. And my question for Dan actually is, I work out with local council, and some, of course, I'm very grateful and they have good experiences, but what I find difficult is often people, maybe not MPs, but other people often change roles very quickly, and because social design is very relational, I need to start again from scratch to build these relationships. So how do we best do that? And then as well, it's of council departments are not Lancaster City Council, but they have all these departments and they don't really join up. So how can we do a better joint-up approach? Because also these sorts of challenges are very complex and require working with business support, with education, regeneration, and so on. And so you mentioned the consultation with the community, but do you think the communities are very authentic in expressing their concerns to the local councils, or they fear, or even they are biased, and maybe a local charity would be a better, or a community citizens UK would be a better to leverage the voice of the community?
Yeah. So I'll try and do each one individually. So I think the first one that you said around that kind of fragmentation issue, absolutely. So that's a challenge, isn't it, for not only, you know, the organisation, the public sector, the local authority, but for co-designers and policy designers and social designers to have those meaningful relationships, and then all of a sudden there's a restructure and a change, and then it kind of it's a stop-start process, isn't it? So I think what we talked about earlier on in the panel was this idea of a policy lab. Now what that means in practice would obviously need to be designed in itself, but could there be some kind of, and you know, secondment and things like that between university and the council, and some kind of function whereby there's a very clear remit to what that is about, and then that kind of fragmentation potentially would decrease because there's a natural resource, and whether it's a hub or it's just the personnel involved with clear objectives for work with social designers, co-designers, other organisations, you would like to think that would stop some of that kind of stop-start mentality and fragmentation. The last bit that you said around community engagement, I completely agree. I think some of the consultation work does prove effective, some of the people's jury being an example of that going back a few years. But I think what I did mention earlier, and I completely agree, is that the council isn't always best suited to do community engagement, and we need to collaborate more with the third, well we do already, but continue collaboration and be a bit more targeted around collaboration with third sector organisations and other stakeholders to really get that authentic community engagement and that voice. So we've had conversations about that recently, like I said, with the football club around health initiatives, because if you were to try and engage with a particular community or in the Morecambe footprint, in the Morecambe geography, they're going to be much more welcoming to get involved with community trust organisation at the football club and the football club that they support, as opposed to a councillor or a cabinet member or an officer at the city council where there's a bit of a disconnect. So I think that's definitely an ambition to do more. And what was the third one?
And I mean, the people change roles pretty quickly, so how can I decide I want to engage with, even if I engage with the same local council for 5 years, but I've seen so many people, so how can that create such related function?
So I think the policy lab, what I mentioned, may address that, but again, it's just a challenge that you need to, we collectively need to navigate, isn't it? Because it's going to be an ongoing problem, and this comes back to some of the challenges we've got around funding and all the rest of it, and devolution and austerity cuts and the problems with the public sector. So I think a policy lab's a route to have a solution, but essentially I think it's going to be something, it's going to be an ongoing challenge to navigate.
Brilliant. We're ready for lunch? Yes. But before, thank you so much to the panelists. I think it was a great discussion. And thank you to all the panelists and the 3 panels. It was amazing for your contribution and all the questions as well. All right, let's go for sugar.